Hi, welcome to the Dieku podcast. I'm Gary Snow. Today, I welcome Jeffrey Talanian, one of the pillars of the old school gaming renaissance and the creative mind behind Astonishing, Swordsmen, and Sorcerers of Hyperborea, which completed the third edition of the game earlier this year. Jeff, welcome.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, we wanted to discuss the whole evolution of Hyperborea, but before we do that, let's delve into your past and how you got started in this crazy little hobby.
You mean like when I was a kid getting into
Yeah,
D&D and stuff?
let's go way back to like how did you discover
Okay.
like when like often people are introduced to it in weird ways.
Yeah, okay. So I grew up in a suburb of Massachusetts before I moved here to New Hampshire. And I was in the 5th grade, and it was a particularly snowy day, and so there was indoor recess because there was like a blizzard going on outside back in the days where we stayed in school during a snowstorm. And so a kid brought this game out and said, play this game called Dungeons and Dragons. So I was like, sure. So a few of us got on to play it with him. And so he was like, what kind of character do you want to make? So I looked at what it was, and I said, so I was like, I want to play a hobbit, And so then he asked me, what do you want to name him? And I was like, well, I want to be Bilbo Baggins. And he said, no, you can't do that. There already is a Bilbo Baggins. You have to do something else. So I said, all right, I'll be his cousin Balbo Baggins. And so it began. We started playing the Keep on the Borderlands. And we had so much fun during that, that brief indoor recess that we decided to all meet together after school and continue playing. So we did so. And then, before you know it, I was getting my first set of books, which was the Eric Holmes basic box set, and running games of D&D in my own neighborhood where I grew up. And, I used the Holmes set. I had a paper route at the time, and I saved my paper route money, and I bought, I couldn't decide which one to get, but I decided since I'm the dungeon master, I must have to get the Dungeon Master's Guide. So I picked up a Dungeon Master's Guide, and I was using that, and I was running Holmes D&D with the Dungeon Master's Guide, and I was probably getting all the rules wrong and everything.
Well, that was going to be one of my questions is like those early days I remember playing, and looking back, we had no idea what the rules were. Were you the same way?
Right. But we didn't have the internet to tell us we were doing it wrong.
So, and you had the 1E Dungeon Master Guide mixing it with the Holmes?
Right. Until eventually there was another kid in the neighborhood who picked up an AD&D player's handbook. And then by that point, the training wheels were off, and we were on to playing AD&D after that.
And were you in the same vein as and often people I've talked to, like AD&D was like advanced. And if you were playing like basic, that was like kids game.
Yes, right? that was for children. Yes. So I remember there was a group like a few years later, I want to say it was around 1983 or so. And there were these apartments that were the next block over from where we lived, and there was a group of kids who played the Mensa basic D&D, and we would frown upon them. They were playing in inferior form, basic. We are advanced, and they are basic. Just the way kids were back then.
Yeah, totally.
I used to buy basic modules all the time and just use them interchangeably with AD&D modules. That didn't really matter.
And did you also, as I did, like as soon as the new covers, the Elmore covers came out, did you like scrap the old books, or did you kind of cling to those older versions?
I kept them both. I ended up having both. Yeah, but I do. One of my biggest regrets was there was a kid down the street who had the Deities and Demigods book, and we used to look at his sometimes, and so I didn't pull the trigger on that until I don't know, a year or so or more later. And so I went to the local Walden Books at the mall and picked it up, and it turned out that I came home and I thought I got ripped off because it didn't have Cthulhu in it. It didn't have Elric in it.
And were you always like kind of a sci-fi kind of nerd, or did that help bring you into that world a little bit more?
No, I think I already was by the time I was getting into D&D. I was reading like Tolkien, obviously, and Edgar Rice Burroughs, and I was reading other stuff too, like Doc Savage and different pulp stuff. I think by the time I was in the 6th grade, I started reading all the Conan books, um, and later introduced to H.P. Lovecraft. I actually was introduced to H.P. Lovecraft by my buddy Bob, um, who introduced a group of gamers to of us in the neighborhood to the game. So I learned of Lovecraft through the game Call of Cthulhu, and then I was like, oh, I want to read some of this stuff. So that's how I got started with some of that.
And a lot of this kind of informed, like later on when we talk about Hyperborea and some of your design choices and that kind of thing. But how did you make that jump from, okay, I'm like a player and I'm enjoying it, and maybe you're forever DM, I'm not too sure, but playing
Yeah,
the
pretty
games. And
much.
did you always think, boy, it would be fun to actually like design games? Like, how did you make that jump from like player into like making and designing games?
Well, it's kind of funny because when I look back at when I was a kid, I was already sort of designing games. I remember being like in middle school, and I was for board games. My friends and I were really into Risk, so I remember being a kid and sort of reinventing a lot of the rules for Risk. And then I drew on a great poster board, an alien world, and using my modified house rules for Risk on an alien planet and creating these different civilizations. And the whole neighborhood of us were playing it. We used to play on that map as often as we played on the real Earth map. And I kind of think of that as kind of like the first time I really started like creating games.
It
Yeah,
sounds like we have like parallel lives, because we did the same thing. We used to hack risk quite a
yeah.
bit, because we were like, we didn't like the way it was, the card collecting went, and we were always
We
like
didn't either. That
making.
was one of our first house rules.
But at some point, like if I'm reading your background a little bit correctly here, that you went into Troll Lord Games and started working with them. Was that kind of your first?
Well, yes and no. So I was I spent several years. I actually owned a collectibles shop in the 90s for about 10 years. I did selling comic books and gaming stuff and baseball cards, and I was getting more and more into writing at the time. And I was running games for my friends, and I was writing a lot of gaming material then, but I was super focused on writing fiction at the time. And then I happened to be running a Greyhawk game at the time, and I was researching some stuff on the internet. This was in 2005,
So
and
early days of the internet for
I
those that are
suppose.
so used to it now.
Right, right. Well, I mean, we were doing AOL in the 90s and stuff like
Yeah.
that. The wild, woolly world of the internet back then. But yeah, so I was um, doing some research on Greyhawk, and I happened to stumble upon Gary Gygax looking for developers for the Iggsburg city setting, which was uh, placed next to Castle Zagig, which is his Castle Greyhawk with the serial numbers filed off. So I thought to myself, what the hell? I'm going to give this a shot. I'm going to send him a submission. So I wrote a cover letter, and I took the hardback Iggsburg book that had already come out and looked at the format and how the various places within the city were developed, and I created a bunch of my own to add to it and as a sample of writing to him. And as I recall, I sent it to him like on a Friday afternoon. And so the weekend went by, and then Monday morning came, and I opened up my email, and I saw Gary Gygax in my inbox. And I recall I didn't want to open it because I thought, here's going to be my rejection letter. There's no way that I'm going to actually work for Gary Gygax developing something, because Gary Gygax and like Stan Lee were my childhood idols growing up. To me, those guys were like on my Mount Rushmore of creatives. And so I opened it up, and as it turned out, he welcomed me onto the team, and I got to start developing some of these city projects. and it worked out really well. There were people who other freelancers who quit the project, so I picked up um, their sectors of the city, and continued to pick up work with Gary, and got more friendly with him, and got to really know him from like, on a personal level, in addition to, like working for him,
And
which was, go ahead.
I was going to say, I'll just pop this picture up
Oh
there.
yeah, sure. That was actually the first time I met him. That they reversed the, I guess I gave it the European. Well, probably for you, I don't know. In Canada, does it do the month first or the day first?
Oh, it depends on the camera. Usually it was always like a crapshoot which way it was going to go.
Yeah, so that was actually June 10th, 2006 from the photo. I was doing the, I guess it was doing date, then month, then year. But anyway, so yeah, that was before we had all these fancy cameras on our phones, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, so I got to work for Gary, and eventually he had been working on the main castle itself with Rob Coons, who was his longtime one of his longtime friends and creative partners, but they had a parting of the ways, unfortunately. And so he asked me if I would like to work on the main dungeon with him and develop that. And so that was, one of the, at that point for my life, that was the highlight of my, creative career in writing, adventure material, so it was a huge thing.
And before we move on, I mean, it's kind of like the Ocean's 11, like, I shook Sinatra's hand, and, the people that have met Gary. Just tell us a little bit, like, what was he like for those that never got to see him around? And I can just imagine him in today's world being on podcasts and that kind of thing. But
yeah, I think he really would. Yeah, because I think he definitely would have embraced podcast interviews and things of that nature, because it started to crop up a little bit towards the end of his lifetime. There's a great one done by Bill Sylvie, who goes by the name of the Dungeon Delver. I think that's his username on a lot of locations. So Bill did a great interview with him, I think within a year or so before Gary passed. But anyway, to answer your question, Gary was he was a brilliant creative. He had such a mind for history, for science, for all kinds of things that you wouldn't expect to. He was into sports. He loved his Chicago Bears. He loved the punnery. He was always busting your chops and twisting your words around around on you to try to make you look like a fool, in a fun way, though, not in a demeaning way. He had like an encyclopedic knowledge on so many topics, and he could just rattle them off. He could talk for hours on end about anything historical, particularly about a lot of things that interested him the most, which was arms and armor and warfare throughout history, particularly the Swiss pikemen and things like that. But one of the things that also impressed me the most about him was the way he connected with fans. He when I got to go to Gen Con and spend time with him, I saw the way the lines would form throughout Gen Con for people to talk to him and to have him sign things. And it was like this endless parade of people who had these great stories to share with him about how D&D helped them in their lives through so many hardships, helped them learn how to read, helped them explore their own creativity, how it helped them find their future spouse, how it helped them develop friendships with groups of people that lasted for decades, and all these things. And what really impressed me was how he would listen to each of them and talk to them, and not just sort of brush them off. Let me hurry up and sign your book and get moving. I don't want to talk to you. He wasn't like that at all. He would listen to them, and he would treat each one like an old friend and contribute to the conversation And I thought that was really impressive because I thought, he probably doesn't have to do this. He could just say, we have to keep the line moving. I'm sorry, I can't talk to you. And people probably wouldn't think twice about it, but he wasn't that way. He really did engage his fan base.
And then working with him, was there ever times that like he would provide feedback and you go, no, I disagree? Or was it, oh, Gary must know best?
No, okay. I guess there's kind of two answers to that. When I first started working for him, I was scared to death of him. And so anything he said, I'd be like, yes, sir. But then I reached a point of being comfortable with him that I would sort of push back a little bit on certain things that I felt. And there's one topic in particular that was a good thing that I did, because when we were doing the Castle Zagig box set for the Upper Works, which is basically the castle itself and the environs around it, I was of the opinion that we should at least include the first dungeon below the castle. And Gary strongly disagreed with me. And we went back and forth over and over and over about it until he finally said, fine, have your way, just put the first level underneath. And it was a good thing we did, because the plug was pulled on the project after he had passed by his widow, who had taken control of his estate. Well, she was always part of his estate. And so it was a good thing that I did, or else we would have never had that first level of the dungeon.
And so at this point, were you still in the Northeast, or did you go to Wisconsin, or how did you do the working relationship?
Oh, I stayed in the Northeast at home, working at home. Everything was remote. And but I would go to see him at Gen Con. And so Troll Lords, they organized a little convention in Lake Geneva called the LGGC, which is the Lake Geneva Gaming Convention. And it had about, I don't know, 200, 300 people, very small. And I would see him there. And actually, the picture that you brought up earlier, that was actually on Gary's porch. And we had a little party before heading over, the night before going to the LGGC. Yeah, Gary was like the host, and he was all excited because he had his homemade baked beans he liked to make, and he was super proud of those. But we would hang around in his porch, and he would tell us stories. We would play games, and then the next day go to the con, and have a great time. So I would see him during the brief time that I got to know him and work for him, which was over the course of about 3 years. I got to see him a couple of times a year, but mostly worked at home.
And were you maintaining the day job, and just doing this as like a bit of a side hustle of freelancing?
Yeah. So that's what I was doing at the time. So I didn't go full time into this hobby until years later, when I went to the second edition of the Hyperborea game, and I started to make more money doing my side hustle than I was at my day job, and it became sort of a no-brainer at that point to go full time with this.
And so before we get to Hyperborea, how were you continuing to do freelance work, or did you kind of put it on the shelf for like periods?
Well, I did. It one sort of transitioned into the other. So when Gary passed in March of 2008, I continued to finish the box set that we had been working on. And then Troll Lord Games published it that summer. It was revealed at Gen Con, but even then I already knew that the project had been pulled and there would be no more after that. So I already had plans going forth that to publish my own game, and I was working on it actively at that time. So I sort of transitioned one into the other. I didn't take I would do the occasional magazine article or something like that, but I wasn't actively taking freelance work after that, because I decided to start my own business.
And so Hyperborea, was it that game that just evolved into what Hyperborea became? The game that you were working on?
Oh, yes. So yeah, that was it. I decided I wanted to make a sword and sorcery themed game with weird fantasy, weird science type elements in it. that was inspired by the works of like H.P. Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard and Clark Ashton Smith. So I started to make a lot of outlines and put all those notes together. I started in the summer of 2008.
Cool. And then I can't help but to notice, like in the thank yous for 1E of Hyperborea, you talked about the trailblazing efforts of Stuart Marshall and Matt Finch, and just the whole OSR scene at that point. And I assume that led into being able to kind of really push Hyperborea to where you wanted it to be.
Well, yeah, I mean, it was a huge risk at the time, and so before those guys did Osric, there was, you had Hackmaster, which was a parody game of AD&D, and you had games like Castles and Crusades, which was, had a lot of traditional themes, but also had a lot of changes to the mechanics that were more modernized. And I really wanted to do something that was traditional in scope. And so when the guys that did Osric put that out there and proved that it could be done, that you could use the OGL in this way, I did, and I still do, looked at it as a trailblazing effort that sort of paved the way for a lot of us to make these, what started off as clones and retro clones. And then, I think one of the things they called my game early on was like a neo clone. I don't know, all the terminology, the nomenclature of all these games can kind of get confusing sometimes, but I prefer to just think of it as a traditional styled role-playing game.
And the mood and the tone of it, obviously, like the Jack Vance Dying Earth kind of thing. Did that come early on through your notes, like you were mentioning? And then how much did that start to inform the actual design process?
Yeah, that's a great question, because early on, when I decided that I wanted to make a setting-based game, I was told by a lot of peers and friends that this was a bad idea, that you shouldn't marry rules to a setting. You should make a generic set of rules because it will sell more to more people. But I really wasn't interested in that. I was more interested in, well, I didn't have any like get rich dreams or anything like that. I didn't imagine that the game would become successful. So from the outset, my goal was to make the game that I wanted to play with my beer drinking buddies. And so I didn't care what people thought I should do to make money or whatever. I didn't care to fill some kind of void in the industry to exploit dollars. What I wanted to do was make something that I wanted to play. So I used those authors that you mentioned as inspiration to create more of a narrow focused type of theme that really could, because when you look at D&D, it's in the appendix N that we all love and refer to. It's really all over the place. The inspirations there. It's a kitchen sink approach of inspirations. So what I wanted to do is have a little bit more of a narrow focus of the pulp authors, and the type of thematic content that they were presenting in their fiction, and sort of represent that in a game-like way, but using mechanics that were Gygaxian in nature.
And when did you kind of like, I mean, because the art is obviously very evocative of that tone. And how did you kind of like arrive on that? Like, was there a lot of iteration and find the right artist to make sure that you're capturing it? And how much direction did you give them, and examples?
Yeah, so it's interesting because Charles Lang, who has done a lot of my covers, he's out of Salem, Massachusetts, and he has primarily done horror art over the years. I don't know if you can see this behind me, but that's Charles Lang art.
Okay.
That one there, because I know there's a bright flash on it, but that's Charles Lang. So anyway,
that one's my favorite, by the way. I love that one.
Oh, cool. So my original box set that I had for the game was based off a painting that Charles Lang had done. And so I knew Charles going back to my days of owning a comic book store in the 90s. And his wife was a comic book artist and writer, and she did some signings at my store. And when she would do these signings at my store, he came along too and brought some of his paintings. And there was one instance in which I bought the painting that's on the original box set. So I had that painting hanging up in my office for years before I ever, considered getting into the role-playing game industry and creating my own game. So when I was building up my outlines to create the Hyperborea game, I had that painting right in my office, and I thought, wouldn't this be awesome? So I contacted him, and he was like, yeah, absolutely, you can use it for the cover. So so that's how it started. So his art sort of paved the way for the stuff that I would then go on to do. But to answer your question more, the type of artists that I look for, I was looking for artists that would evoke that sort of savage sort of Conan, pulp fiction, not so much like the anime type of art that you see in a lot of games today, which is sort of, that style is great, and it's leaked into a lot of publications over the years, but I wanted something that really evoked that the pulps.
And that's great. And I know I've got my copy of 2E here.
Yeah.
But when you first did the 1E Kickstarter, and now I can't help it, like I went back and I went, okay, from 1E to 3E, and the Kickstarter for 1E made, and it might be Canadian dollars, so I'm sorry if this is not quite right, but it was 13,000. And
Yeah.
then I think you had 170,000 for 3E.
Yeah.
Can you even imagine the fact that like the Kickstarter from 1E to 3E and how it's grown over the years?
Yeah, it's really amazing because, like I mentioned earlier, I didn't have any idea that it would become successful. So when I first created the 1E version of the game in that box set, I thought that I would have those. I thought that I would still have those now, that I would sell one every couple of months, but I sold out of them in a few years, which, kind of forced me into going. Well, it didn't force me. I suppose I could have reprinted it, but there were a lot of things I wanted to throw in there, so it ended up going to a second edition.
And like you said, you could have just reprinted it, but you also had some adventures that kind of added to the scope of the game and that kind of thing. And now that you're kind of like you've got your world setting and also the game kind of as one piece, is this your baby? Like, do you kind of see this as your legacy? Do you ever go, oh, you know what, I really would have liked to have tried this or tried that and done a different style of game?
No, I still do enjoy it, and I still enjoy writing materials for it. I really enjoy doing content editing on the submissions of other writers, and so yeah, I guess I do. Yeah.
And the community that you've built up, obviously a lot of loyal fans, and word keeps continuing to grow. And with that, I guess the user base, do you get a lot of feedback still? Do you get those kind of letters or people that speak to you almost like Gary, where, hey, you did this for me and you did that for me, and you changed my life in some small way?
Well, yeah, there are a lot of people that send me emails or direct messages on different social media platforms, who as I understand it, they have a love of the same type of sword and sorcery themed fiction and gaming that I do. And discovering this game was sort of like a breath of fresh air to them, and it's funny too, because a lot of them will tell me that this is the way they've been running their games for years with this type of content, and they're so happy to run into a formalized version of it that they could run.
And for those, I probably jumped a little bit ahead here. For those that have not discovered Hyperborea, do you prefer, I love the long name, but do you just kind of shorten it to Hyperborea now?
Yeah, I do. I usually do. Yeah, it's a mouthful.
I usually trip over it, but I love the evocative naming of it. But
Right.
for those that maybe have not discovered it yet, like what's the kind of the game pitch as far as like the tone and the feel of it versus let's just use 5e as like the counterpoint of what Hyperborea can be.
Well, it's like I said, it's inspired by Lovecraft and Smith and Howard, and it's setting rich, and there are all these different ethnicities of characters that you can play within the game. Some of them have real world counterparts, others are mythological, in the sense that we have like Celts and Picts and Cimmerians, and but we also have, and we have Romans, but we also have things like Atlanteans and Amazons and the native Hyperborean race themselves, which is inspired by, you know, a number of sources, including Greek mythology, because that's what the source of Hyperborea is. It's in the old Greek language, it means beyond the north wind, and so Hyperborea was originally written by the Greek scholars of the day, Herodotus and Pindar, and I'm not sure if Plato wrote about Hyperborea, but a number of the ancient Greek philosophers would write about it the same way they would write about Atlantis. So there's some of that in there too, draw inspiration from the mythology parts of things. And so we have all these different races and ethnicities that have all crossed the veil into this far-flung, futuristic world that is overlooked by an enormous red giant dying sun. It has these two moons that revolve around it. One of them that's really fast, it's full every 7 days, and the other one is full like every 90 days. And so one of the concepts of the setting's history is that there was a plague that nearly wiped out humanity about 1,000 years ago, known as the Green Death. And so humanity's been sort of trying to bounce back from that ever since. And the world is populated by all these eldritch horrors and, you know, Cthulhu-like creatures and Vancian type weird otherworldly races. And so it is all sort of built upon this one large continent on a flat Earth setting. It's also a flat Earth. I neglected to mention that. It's a flat Earth in which the seas spill eternally off the edge of the world. So between it being a flat Earth and the giant red dying sun and all this stuff, it's I'd like to say that it has its own uniqueness that would separate it from, you know, you mentioned 5e. I don't see 5e doing anything like that. You know, not that there was no such thing as 5e when I was writing this game. I think I want to say that 4th edition wasn't even out yet. I think it was still at the end of 3rd edition.
And I think one of the things, you know, I've heard you often kind of refer to, like, just the tone of it. Like, you know, 5e, as many old school OSR fans are aware of, it's kind of like heroic fantasy and often high fantasy. But this is like where you're sneaking in to steal the gem off a demon statue type of thing. It's like scrappy, very personal stories of just making your way in this world.
Right. That's a great way to put it.
And with that said, the flat Earth, I got to ask: are you a flat earther? Are you is there an ice wall that I need to go past in Antarctica? And
I don't know. I mean, what proof is there that the world is a sphere? I mean,
exactly.
No, I'm just kidding.
I get going down those rabbit holes on TikTok. I love those like old weird conspiracies of like, you know,
they're great.
The old giants and the mud floods and all that kind of stuff. I love that stuff.
Yeah.
But so
it's
anyways,
good fodder for campaign material.
Oh, I know.
You know, if you can find good.
And then, you know, on the business side of things, as I mentioned, a lot of my followers are, you know, aspiring game designers. And the business side, how much did you have to learn from the business standpoint? I mean, you ran your own store, so that must have been a really good foundation.
Yeah, to a certain degree, but it's different than, working with printers and freelance writers and artists and editors. And the convention part is similar, except you're displaying as a publisher as opposed to bringing tons of stock and selling stuff like I used to do at comic book conventions. But so yeah, so there's some overlap, but I probably definitely made a lot of mistakes early on. Had lessons learned and try to network with my peer group. Having worked as a freelancer for some years before, I got to know a lot of people from doing the convention circuit. So I had a lot of friends, and so I was able to sort of lean on them when I had questions about, say, the reliability of a certain printer, or anything related to that sort of stuff. So I would say to people who are aspiring to get into publishing in role-playing games in the indie scene. First of all, there are a lot of people, myself included, who will answer questions for you. Very happy to steer you in the right direction for something. But now there's also a lot of conventions have panel discussions that do this very thing. So you can have a panel of some of the brightest minds in this industry that will elaborate on a number of different topics and then take questions from the audience. I took part in a few this past weekend at Gamehole Con in Madison, and they were great, and people ask great questions, and they're questions of things that sometimes that I suppose I would take for granted because they're things that I've been doing for so long. But for them, they just don't know because they've never worked in the industry yet.
And you mentioned some of those mistakes. Do you care to share any that you go, oh, like it was such an obvious one that I don't know why I made it, but I did, and I should steer people away from it?
I'd say one of the biggest mistakes I made early on is when I did that first Kickstarter box set. There were a few things that I didn't realize. Number one, I didn't realize that you can't send a box set media mail in the US, that it's considered a game at that point, which is a different category, that media mail is reserved for strictly books, not boxes. That was one mistake I made because then that costs you more for shipping. The other thing I did wrong was a miscalculation of what the final weight of my boxes was going to be, which was not a big deal in the USA for domestic shipments, but for international shipments, not so much Canada at the time, because even back then, in 2012, it was really only a little bit more to ship to Canada than it was to the US, and something changed that all of a sudden it's, Canadian rates doubled over the years. But
Mhm.
anyway, so my big mistake is that I had estimated the box and its contents to be under 4 pounds. And at that time, anything under 4 pounds could go in the category that was called first class international, which was a much cheaper rate. But once you went over 4 pounds, you had to go priority international, which was a lot more expensive. Now, today, we have so many more options, and a lot of times UPS or FedEx or DHL, and there's a number of other smaller couriers that work with different agencies. So none of that was really available to me back then. So at that time, having mismanaged the weight factor, I got hit with some pretty hard fees. I reached out to my community of the people that I had already charged for shipping, and I said, look, I know I stated this and I only charged you this, but if you can chip in a little bit more, that's great. If you can't, then I'll suck it up. And because at that time, it was a, $13,000 Kickstarter, like you mentioned. And, so I was pulling out of my own savings to make up for that miscalculation.
And that's always, I think, the scary part. I've had other creators kind of talk about that, where they, you go, "Did I put the decimal in the right spot?" And then like everything's a mess. Do you still get nervous when you hit publish on the Kickstarter to go, "Okay, we're live now," and or is it kind of becoming a little bit more, "Oh, we're gone through this before, I can do it again"?
Yeah, I still kind of do, because there are certain things that you can't take back once you make a mistake, and once you start taking people's money. You can't change the pledge levels if you've made a mistake with one. So I tend to one of the things I try to do is put other eyes on these things besides my own. Have uh, people who trusted confidants of mine take a look at it and read through it and make sure everything makes sense, and feel free to question me on things that don't make sense, type of thing. So yeah, so I still get a little nervous, even though I've done so many of them now, that I will be messing up something. So I go over it over and over and over before I hit that launch button.
And 3E was recently in the bundle of holding, and I know that caused a lot of fervor. Uh, how does that actually take place? I've always been curious. Do they approach you, or how does that work?
Yeah, he's approached me. The guy that runs it, Alan. He's a great guy, and he does a great job at presenting these things. He has a role playing. He's been in the industry for a number of years and transitioned to doing this. And so I was initially approached by him, and so we sort of revisit it now every couple of years.
And I guess, like, moving forward, do you have any like things on the near horizon, new adventures, fourth E eventually to likely
No, we're not
come?
talking about. No,
Not
no, we're
yet.
not talking about that. Yeah, no, that'll be a long time. But yeah, so we have three new adventure modules coming out, and I'm hoping to kickstart them this January. I'm going deeper with these than I've ever done any other project before, due to issues that have cropped up in the print industry ever since COVID. And I continue to hear nightmare stories from fellow publishers of delays and excuses and things like that from printers. So this time around, for these three adventure modules that I'm going to launch at the same time, I'm really looking at the writing is all in, the cover art is all in, most of the interior art is in, editing is underway, and I want to start getting into layout before I actually launch. So it's trying to be, keep everything, uh, have everything prepared before we actually launch.
Have you done that in previous times, or was there still kind of like 90% there and loose ends before you went to Kickstarter?
What I used to do is have the covers in and have the writing in and have editing underway, and and art would still be in progress. But at this time around, all the art's going to be in before I launch. I mean, I may add a few things. That's always kind of like, it's kind of like a tricky thing. You can say all the art is in, but then you get to layout and you have a really weird white space somewhere. So I might, call one of my guys and say, "Hey, can you do something that fits in a 4 inch by 4 inch space?" And describe to them a couple of things on the page, or email them, and fill that space. So it's not like the art is always completely done, because it's a process like that.
And do you get moved to the front of the line for these artists that like you got a nice relationship with them where they can squeeze it in, or are they kind of booked and you have to kind of wait sometimes?
It's can be mixed, because some of the artists that I've been working with for over 10 years, and I have a great relationship with them. But I know that they have busy schedules. Some of them do art full time, and that is their career, and they have to do what's best for their families. And others are doing it as a side hustle and have a full-time job, and it can only fit in doing the art when they can fit the time in to do it. So I don't try to be too demanding with any of them, and try to get to the front of the line, per se.
And as we kind of come to a close here, obviously there's the OGL Fiasco that probably didn't impact 3E because it was already kind of baked in. But how do you see the industry going, whether it's OSR or like indie games, and is there anything that kind of excites you that you see that you're like, oh wow, like I never thought that was going to happen, but it has?
Well, I mean, I think the thing that shocked a lot of us is that they tried to pull that in the first place. But then when you looked at the people who they brought in to run that company, then it didn't surprise you so much because they were, executives from the tech world who didn't have a history in gaming, and they were just basically looking at it as a property, and they wanted to make changes to that property and what they were forecasting their future to be. So I think that they quickly learned that it was a big mistake, and they rectified it in a way that shocked me even more than what they had originally done by putting all that material in the Creative Commons. So that was a big relief because, I mean, honestly, since I've been publishing my game and friends have been publishing their games, I've always had it in the back of my mind that at some point someone could come around, some type of leadership within Hasbro or Wizards of the Coast, that they could come around and challenge the OGL and somehow have it removed and pull our rights to continue publishing this stuff. I've always considered it as a possibility, but now that this stuff is in the Creative Commons, it's like the cat's out of the bag now.
Cool. And anything exciting you as far as like in the indie space? Like I know, do you still, I assume you're still friends with a lot of the people in the OSR and the retro clone kind of area, but do you see things that are like kind of newer that you go, huh, I didn't think that was going to happen? Some of more like minimalist games or anything of that sort?
One of the things that I think is really cool is, they were so popular back in like the 70s but in fiction was the zines, and a lot of them were like, I used to do one for Michael Moorcock that I subscribed to, and I used to get another one that was a Robert E. Howard related one, and just different, and another one I did with for Edgar Rice Burroughs stuff, and so I think it's so cool that there are all these different weird and wacky zines that come out now, that really like embrace all kinds of different thematic content all over the place. You have like Levi Combs does a lot of great ones. Jim Wampler, Ian and Rocky from Silver Bullet, Skeeter Green. These guys are all do these cool little zine projects, and each one of them is different from the next. You could have a weird West theme, you could have a sci-fi zine, post-apocalyptic, and it's really like any of them can sort of meet the sort of, it's almost like a toolbox. You can pick up one of these zines and say, hey, this little nugget right here, I can throw this in my game, or that's a really cool artifact or item. I'd like to put that in one of my adventures. So I think that's like this sort of toolbox mentality that they're giving us more tools by pumping out these various zines.
And finally, reflecting upon, I mean, you still have a lot of runway ahead of you. So I'm not saying you're at the end of your career, but reflecting upon, that recess Dungeons and Dragons session and your group of friends that you played with and perhaps still maintain contact with or even play with today. Can you believe that you're doing what you're doing? It must be and you're doing it full time. It must be a bit of a dream come true.
Yeah, it's I just, you never know which way life is going to take you, and it is sort of a dream come true to be creating this kind of stuff. But my wife has supported me all along and supported my crazy ambitions with this stuff, and has always been there for me throughout this. So if she wasn't the solid rock that she was throughout the highs and lows of doing this stuff, I can't say that I would still be here now.
Well, Jeff, I just want to say thank you for coming on the Dieku podcast. Appreciate you sharing all your knowledge and wisdom with everybody. And I wish you best in the future, and please come back.
Okay, I will do. Thanks for having me.